On the cold morning of March 19, 1808, the streets of Aranjuez shook under the sound of furious crowds demanding the abdication of Charles Roman IV. Beside him stood his son, the 24-year-old prince who would soon be known as Ferdinand Roman VII, a man whose reign would plunge Spain into one of its darkest eras. Few in the crowd understood that the young man they were cheering for was about to become the most destructive monarch Spain had ever endured. They knew nothing of his private appetites, his secret obsessions, or the intimate scandals that would one day stain the Bourbon dynasty. They saw only a savior, not a tyrant. They saw hope, not the man who would later be remembered as the most perverted king in Spanish history. But history would reveal the truth. Ferdinand Roman VII was not shaped by courage, ambition, or a sense of duty. He was shaped by paranoia, jealousy, and a twisted hunger for personal indulgence. The Spain he inherited was already fragile, but the Spain he left behind was broken, humiliated, and morally exhausted. And at the center of this national decay was a king whose darkest secrets influenced the throne more deeply than his political decisions. To understand how Spain collapsed into misery, you must first understand the childhood of the man who would become its tormentor. Ferdinand grew up in the rigid, ceremonial world of the Bourbon Palace, where every gesture was watched, every conversation measured, and every mistake punished by his dominating mother, Queen Maria Luisa. Whispers inside the court hinted that Ferdinand's father, Charles Roman IV, was weak, distracted, and easily manipulated. Some claimed that Manuel Godoy, the Queen's powerful and handsome favorite, held more authority than the king himself. These rumors poisoned Ferdinand from a young age, filling him with insecurity and resentment. By the age of 15, Ferdinand had already developed a personality that courtiers described as cold, withdrawn, and strangely fixated on matters that had nothing to do with statecraft. While other princes were trained in politics, diplomacy, and philosophy, Ferdinand's education gravitated towards secrecy, control, and unhealthy curiosity about the intimate lives of those around him. Accounts from within the palace claim that he took a disturbing interest in the private behavior of court women, especially young ladies, in waiting. Gossip circulated that the prince would send servants to spy on them, recording their interactions, rivalries, and scandals. Though many stories were exaggerated by hostile nobles, a pattern began to emerge. Ferdinand enjoyed power not through governance, but through intrusion. It was a hint of the king he would later become. By 1807, Spain was collapsing under the weight of foreign pressure. Napoleon Bonaparte was squeezing the country with promises of alliance and threats of invasion. Inside the court, factionalism reached a breaking point. Ferdinand plotted against his own parents, accusing Godoy of treason and challenging the Queen's authority. The royal family turned against each other with venomous hatred, and amid this chaos, the people of Spain convinced themselves that Ferdinand was the one who could restore order. They were disastrously wrong. When Ferdinand Roman VII finally claimed the throne after the Aranjuez uprising, Spain erupted in celebration. Bells rang, crowds cheered, priests offered prayers for the new monarch. But within weeks, the facade crumbled. Napoleon summoned Ferdinand to Bayonne, where he stripped him of the crown with humiliating ease. Spain fell into the devastating Peninsular War, but Ferdinand's true nature revealed itself during his comfortable captivity in France. Instead of worrying for his suffering people, he enjoyed banquets, amusement, and private entertainments provided by Napoleon's court. Letters from Spanish officials describe him as detached, indulgent, and strangely fascinated with the young women who attended social functions arranged for him. Even in exile, his personal obsessions overshadowed his sense of responsibility. When the war ended and he returned to Spain in 1814, he was greeted not as a failure, but as the desired one. Crowds knelt as he passed, believing their suffering was finally over. But behind the palace walls, the king's secret habits began to intensify. Ferdinand's first marriage to Maria Antonia of Naples had been troubled by his coldness and erratic behavior. Court physicians recorded the Queen's complaints that the king's private conduct was unpredictable, obsessive, and driven by impulses she described as deeply unsettling. Rumors spread that Ferdinand's interests went far beyond the normal boundaries of royal marriage, and that his expectations in the bedchamber strained the young queen physically and emotionally. When she died in 1806 at only 21, many suspected that the constant pressure of their marriage had contributed to her decline, though no official accusation was ever recorded. Back on the throne in 1814, Ferdinand became far worse than Spain ever imagined. Publicly, he restored absolutism, abolished the liberal constitution, arrested dissenters, and ordered brutal repression. Privately, his obsessions escalated to a level that shocked even his closest advisers. The palace staff began noticing his increasingly inappropriate behavior toward young female servants, dancers, and actresses invited for private entertainment. Some royal guards later testified that the king demanded detailed reports about these women, their ages, appearances, and personal histories, before allowing them to enter his presence. The king's nightly routines became infamous, whispered about across Madrid but never officially recorded. Foreign ambassadors wrote in their personal diaries that Ferdinand's court was filled with an atmosphere of secrecy and moral decay. One Italian diplomat described it as a palace where fear, corruption, and indulgence lived side by side. French envoys, still monitoring Spain after Napoleon's defeat, noted that the king's personal habits seemed to dominate his schedule more than affairs of state. He neglected governance, ignored reforms, and focused instead on fulfilling fantasies that court confessors struggled to condemn without risking their lives. By the 1820s, Spain was spiraling. The economy was collapsing, uprisings broke out, colonies in the Americas revolted for independence, and the king seemed disturbingly detached. Those close to him, said Ferdinand, cared only about preserving his authority and pursuing the indulgences that had now become central to his private life. The darkest years of his reign were only beginning. The full consequences of Ferdinand Roman VII's secret life, on his family, on his successors, and on the fate of Spain itself, would unfold in the years that followed, and the most shocking details were yet to emerge. When Ferdinand Roman VII returned to power in 1814, Spain expected a savior. Instead, they received a monarch whose private desires consumed him far more than the affairs of state. As the king settled into the royal palace of Madrid, a disturbing transformation began to unfold behind its polished marble floors, gold-lined hallways, and perfectly choreographed ceremonies. Ministers, guards, servants, and foreign envoys soon realized that beneath the ceremonial dignity of the Bourbon crown hid a man whose indulgences overshadowed every political decision he made. The palace may have projected grandeur, but within its walls, fear and secrecy reigned. The king became known for unpredictable moods. In the morning, he might appear calm and thoughtful, meeting with advisers as if he were finally ready to rule responsibly. By nightfall, he would abandon all restraint, slipping into private chambers where dancers, actresses, and young attendants waited under the orders of his most trusted courtiers. Many of these courtiers, seeking to maintain favor, fed the king's obsessions with a steady supply of amusements. The palace became a hive of whispers, secret bribes, and carefully orchestrated visits meant to cater to Ferdinand's desires. Spain's decline accelerated while its king drowned in indulgence. Ferdinand's reputation for extreme possessiveness grew rapidly. Any woman he took an interest in, whether noble or servant, faced intense scrutiny. Some were interrogated about their personal relationships, their previous experiences, even their manner of dress. Several palace staff later recounted in diaries that the king's fascination with youth bordered on obsession. He favored the very young, the vulnerable, the inexperienced and preferred women who could not question his authority. What began as secret impropriety soon evolved into open exploitation within the palace walls. Servants warned each other in hushed voices to avoid the upper halls after dark. The most disturbing stories came from those forced to entertain him. One former court dancer, writing years after the king's death, claimed that noble families who owed the crown favors would sometimes send daughters to serve in palace entertainment troupes. These troops were often summoned at night, and while their public performances were harmless, their private sessions were anything but. Once summoned, the girls could not refuse. Those who did risked their families' livelihoods or worse, accusations of disloyalty. Court officials insisted that all entertainment was voluntary, but private journals from the era suggest a darker truth. The palace priests attempted to intervene, but their influence was severely limited. Ferdinand, already paranoid and mistrustful of clergy, viewed confessions as a threat to his control. Several confessors were dismissed when they attempted to impose moral discipline on the king's nightly habits. Eventually, the palace appointed spiritual advisors who knew better than to question the monarch's behavior. Religion became a tool of convenience for Ferdinand, not a boundary. Meanwhile, his marriages continued to reflect the turmoil of his personal life. After the death of his first wife, Maria Antonia, Ferdinand remarried in 116. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, was 17 years old. She was cheerful, polite, and described by ambassadors as a kind-hearted young woman eager to fulfill her royal duties. But within months, courtiers whispered that the king treated her with an intensity that frightened her attendants. Maria Isabel's health deteriorated soon after childbirth. When she died tragically in 1818 at the age of 21, the court mourned her sincerely, but the Queen's physicians quietly noted that her final months were marked by exhaustion, stress, and unusual pressure from the king. Her death, though officially attributed to childbirth complications, fueled rumors that Ferdinand's demanding nature contributed to her decline. His third marriage was even more scandalous. In 1819, Ferdinand married Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, another young bride barely out of adolescence. She was raised in a devout Catholic household and entered the Spanish court unprepared for the darkness awaiting her. Her upbringing emphasized strict moral discipline, modesty, and religious purity. According to Saxon correspondence, she expected marriage to be solemn and respectful. What she encountered instead was a king whose expectations left her terrified. Maria Josepha was so traumatized by the king's behavior that she refused to share his bed for weeks. She wept during private audiences, confiding in her ladies, in waiting that the king's demands violated everything she had been taught. She was deeply religious, fearful of sin, and horrified by the monarch's increasingly explicit instructions. Attempts to comfort her failed, and her fear became a matter of international discussion among diplomats. The Vatican even received letters asking whether the marriage could be annulled due to her profound distress. But Ferdinand refused to let her escape. The Queen eventually complied out of obligation, but the emotional damage remained. She never bore children, and reports from the time indicate that she lived quietly, dutifully, and in constant fear until her death in 129 at only 25. This pattern revealed something deeply troubling. Ferdinand's personal relationships were not partnerships. They were exercises of dominance. While his wives suffered, Spain was collapsing. The king's neglect of governance allowed corruption to flourish. International crises raged. Spanish colonies in the Americas, long discontent with European rule, began breaking away one by one. Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and others fought for and won independence during Ferdinand's reign. Each loss weakened Spain's economy and global standing. Foreign observers noted that while an empire was slipping through his fingers, Ferdinand remained preoccupied with maintaining control over his personal world. His obsessions extended far beyond his marriages and palace entertainment. Among the darkest rumors circulating in the court were reports that the king frequently demanded to watch intimate interactions among palace entertainers, insisting on supervising everything personally. Though such accounts cannot be definitively proven, the consistency of these claims across private diaries, foreign correspondence, and later historical analysis suggests that Ferdinand's sexual curiosity evolved into voyeuristic practices that shocked even his closest attendants. Some guards claimed the king required detailed written accounts of the private behavior of female servants. Others reported that he replaced attendants frequently, not because they failed their duties, but because he lost interest. These stories painted a portrait of a monarch who viewed women not as individuals, but as instruments of his fantasies. Meanwhile, his physical health deteriorated. Excess, stress, and lack of disciplined routine caused weight gain, swelling, and severe digestive issues. He walked with difficulty, slept irregularly, and relied heavily on stimulants and sedatives. Physicians around him struggled to manage his worsening condition. His declining health only intensified his paranoia. He distrusted advisors, suspected conspiracies where none existed, and accused officials of plotting to restrict his freedoms. By the late 1820s, the king had become a grotesque symbol of Spain's decay. The nation had lost its colonies, its economy was broken, and its people endured famine, censorship, and fear. Yet within the palace, indulgence continued as if the kingdom were thriving. Ferdinand could not see the suffering around him. The only reality that mattered to him was the world he controlled behind closed doors. And then came the most disturbing chapter of all, one involving his young fourth wife, a girl who would reshape Spanish history and expose the darkest dimensions of the king's character. This final marriage would reveal secrets so unsettling that even Ferdinand's staunch supporters struggled to defend him. When Ferdinand VII chose his fourth wife in 1829, the Spanish court fell into a stunned silence. The bride was Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, only 20, 3 years old, calm, modest, and politically inexperienced. But what shocked the court was not her youth. It was the expectation that she would bear the king an heir despite his deteriorating health, unstable personality, and disturbing private behavior, which had already devastated 3 queens before her. Spain had grown desperate, the Bourbon dynasty needed a successor, and Ferdinand, increasingly paranoid, believed that producing an heir was the only way to secure his legacy. Everything about this marriage reflected urgency, fear, and a determined desire to control the future, regardless of the emotional cost. Maria Cristina arrived in Madrid hopeful, gentle, and unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in the palace before her. She was raised in a religious environment, trained to be obedient, respectful, and devoted to her royal duties. But she lacked experience in court politics and had never encountered a ruler with habits as unpredictable as Ferdinand's. On her wedding night, she learned the truth. Court attendants reported that the young queen emerged from her private chamber pale and trembling, speaking little and avoiding eye contact. She quickly realized that the king's desires were not guided by affection or partnership, but by desperation. Ferdinand was aging rapidly, physically weak, and dependent on stimulants to sustain even basic activity. Yet at night, he was consumed by an obsessive urgency to produce an heir. Doctors warned him repeatedly that his approach endangered both his health and the queen's. But Ferdinand had never listened to medical advice, and he refused to begin now. He developed an unhealthy fixation on ensuring Maria Cristina conceived quickly. According to palace staff, he timed their private meetings rigidly, demanded reports from his physicians about fertility, and grew enraged at the slightest suggestion that he might be contributing to the difficulty. The pressure on the queen was suffocating. She was expected to perform her role flawlessly, bear the emotional burden of the king's obsession and remain silent. This environment of fear and manipulation intensified the darkest aspects of Ferdinand's personality. Whenever political crises overwhelmed him, he turned even more aggressively toward controlling the Queen's private life. Maria Cristina endured a pattern familiar to those who had served the king in earlier years: unpredictable demands, emotional manipulation, and absolute dominance. But she differed from his previous wives in one crucial way. Maria Cristina was intelligent, diplomatic, and quietly strategic. She understood that survival required patience. She understood that resisting the king directly would only deepen his cruelty. Most importantly, she understood that if she bore a child, she could influence the future of Spain. And in 1830, the moment Ferdinand had long obsessed over finally arrived. Maria Cristina became pregnant. The court erupted in celebration. Bells rang across Madrid. Priests delivered sermons praising divine mercy. For the first time in years, the monarchy seemed stable. But this pregnancy unleashed a political war that would tear the country apart. Ferdinand VII had no surviving sons, and under traditional succession law, his brother Don Carlos was the rightful heir. Carlos was a rigid absolutist, deeply conservative, and supported by factions within the church and the military. His rule would have locked Spain into an even darker form of authoritarianism. To prevent this, Ferdinand passed a decree allowing his future daughter to inherit the crown, an action that enraged Carlos and ignited what would later become the Carlist Wars. But the king did not care about political consequences. He saw only one thing: his chance at immortality through an heir. Meanwhile, his health deteriorated dramatically. His obesity worsened. Gangrene threatened his legs. His face became swollen, his breath labored, and his eyes dull from exhaustion and medication. Even as his body failed, the king refused to relinquish control of the queen's private life. When Maria Cristina gave birth to Isabella in 1830, Ferdinand was overcome with pride. But when she failed to conceive again quickly, the pressure returned. Court physicians noted that the king became increasingly demanding and irrational, insisting on frequent examinations of the queen and interrogating servants about her routines. His fixation on producing a second child, preferably a son, reached disturbing levels. Maria Cristina endured it silently, focusing instead on securing her daughter's future. By 1832, Ferdinand's condition was so severe that ministers feared he would die at any moment. His legs were blackened from infection. His voice had weakened to a whisper. He fainted during meetings, struggled to breathe at night, and suffered violent attacks of pain. As he lay bedridden, barely capable of speaking, his paranoia worsened. He believed enemies were poisoning him. He believed his brother Carlos was planning to seize the crown before Isabella could be officially recognized. He believed the court would overthrow Maria Cristina the moment he died. To counter these imagined threats, Ferdinand demanded constant surveillance, interrogations, and reports. Servants could not move freely without permission. Ministers walked on eggshells. Even Maria Cristina could not leave his bedside without explaining where she was going and why. Despite his obsessive need for control, Ferdinand's grip on reality slipped further. He alternated between rage and pleading, promising the queen riches one moment and threatening her the next. Foreign envoys recorded that the king's mental state had collapsed into irrationality. Some described him as childlike, others as tyrannical, but all agreed that he was consumed by fear. In the midst of this chaos, the queen gave birth to a second daughter, Maria Luisa Fernanda, in 1832. This was a diplomatic victory for Maria Cristina, but a psychological defeat for Ferdinand, who had desperately hoped for a son. His disappointment deepened his paranoia and darkened the palace atmosphere further. The king's final weeks were marked by a shocking combination of physical agony and obsessive desire. Unable to walk, barely able to speak, he still demanded that the queen sleep near him, attend to him, and reassure him constantly. The palace staff described these final scenes as unbearably uncomfortable. The king's obsession with dominance persisted until his last breath. On September 29, 1008, 133, Ferdinand Roman VII finally died, but his death did not bring peace. Instead, it unleashed the Carlist Wars, years of brutal civil conflict that tore Spain apart. His legacy became synonymous with repression, corruption, collapse, and scandal. His secret life, long whispered about behind palace walls, became the subject of historical analysis, diplomatic diaries, and memoirs written by those who had witnessed the decay firsthand. Maria Cristina, freed from the king's shadow, immediately took control as regent for the infant Isabella. She moved swiftly, reforming the palace, dismissing corrupt officials, and purging the network of servants and courtiers who had enabled Ferdinand's darkest behaviors. Only after his death did the world grasp the full extent of the internal rot that had consumed the monarchy during his reign. And yet, the most disturbing secrets of Ferdinand Roman VII were not fully surfaced. In the private archives of foreign diplomats, in the diaries of dismissed priests, in the letters of palace entertainers, and in the testimonies of frightened servants, lay the final truth about the monarch Spain wished it could forget. A truth that revealed why history remembers him not just as a tyrant, but as the most perverted king in the country's past. A truth that would shape Spain's perception of monarchy for generations. When Ferdinand Roman VII died in 1833, Spain breathed as though a long and painful weight had finally lifted. Bells tolled across Madrid not with triumph, but with exhaustion, as if the nation itself exhaled after decades suffocated by repression, corruption, decay, and scandal. But even in death, the king's darkest secrets refused to stay buried. Over the next decades, diplomats, priests, servants, ministers, and historians uncovered the pieces of a truth far more disturbing than the official records ever dared to reveal. What emerged was not merely the portrait of a tyrant. It was the portrait of a monarch whose private appetites corrupted not only his own life, but the entire fabric of the Spanish court. To understand the scale of Ferdinand's hidden world, one must turn to the archives that survived his reign despite efforts to destroy them. Hidden in private collections, foreign libraries, and the personal diaries of those who served him, these sources reveal the disturbing machinery of a palace designed to protect the king's desires at any cost. The first revelations came from the correspondence of foreign ambassadors who had been stationed in Madrid. One French diplomat wrote in 126, that the Spanish court had become a place where public dignity masked private degradation. He described in restrained diplomatic language that the king maintained a secret arrangement of nocturnal diversions, involving dancers and young women from the lower classes. These women were summoned without warning, escorted quietly through side entrances of the palace, and dismissed before dawn under oath of silence. Such testimonies, repeated in letters from British, Italian, and Austrian envoys, reveal that Ferdinand's private behaviors had become a matter of international curiosity. Foreign courts viewed him with embarrassment and pity. Some believed he was mentally unstable. Others saw him as a decadent ruler trapped in the excesses of a fading empire. But the most disturbing accounts came not from diplomats, but from those who served inside the palace itself. When Queen Maria Cristina assumed the regency after the king's death, she ordered a full reorganization of the palace staff. During this process, several former attendants, freed from the threat of punishment, provided confidential statements about the environment they had endured. These reports, preserved in fragments across various archives, described a palace ruled less by governance and more by obsession. One chambermaid recalled that young female attendants were frequently replaced, not because of incompetence, but because the king insisted on new faces. In his surroundings, Another servant testified that the king demanded detailed reports about the personal behavior of palace entertainers, including their relationships, their arguments, and even their private habits. Such intrusive monitoring suggested a ruler more interested in voyeurism and control than leadership. A dismissed priest, writing anonymously in a Catholic journal years later, claimed that Ferdinand sought spiritual guidance not for repentance, but for reassurance that his behavior did not jeopardize his authority. According to the priest, the king confessed obsessively not to cleanse his conscience, but to manipulate the church into validating his behavior. Whenever a confessor challenged him, Ferdinand would replace him immediately. The palace became a revolving door of clergy, each chosen for their willingness to remain silent. More revelations emerged from the diaries of Spanish nobles. Many wrote cautiously, fearing future retaliation even after the king's death. But their private journals describe a monarch whose personal desires shaped royal proceedings. One nobleman wrote that during evening gatherings, the king frequently abandoned political discussions to summon entertainers or to gossip about the intimate lives of those serving in the palace. Ministers complained that critical decisions were delayed because Ferdinand had dismissed meetings early to indulge in private distractions. Even the king's marriages reveal the depth of his personal obsessions. Maria Cristina, his fourth wife, later admitted in private letters that the king's demands were so consuming that she often prayed for his health to fail simply so she could escape the emotional strain. She wrote that during her pregnancies, the king's pressure intensified, and she lived in constant fear that failure to produce a male heir would provoke his rage. In another letter to her sister, she described the king as a man chained to appetites he cannot control, who fears nothing more than losing command over those around him. These personal testimonies provided historians with a clearer understanding of why Ferdinand's reign drove Spain into chaos. While he indulged in his private world, Spain lost most of its colonies, the treasury collapsed, famine spread across provinces, nobles fled the court, military uprisings multiplied. Yet the king's energy remained focused not on rebuilding the nation, but on feeding the obsessions that had become the center of his identity. Ferdinand's darkest legacy was not merely his personal perversion. It was the ripple effect of his behavior on the political structure around him. His paranoia led to mass arrests. His jealousy led to purges of ministers and generals. His obsession with control led to a suffocating censorship that silenced the press and stifled education. His indulgence drained the royal treasury and strengthened networks of corrupt officials who knew the king relied on them to fulfill his desires. By the time of his death, the monarchy itself had rotted from within. Spain entered the Carlist Wars not because of external enemies, but because the monarchy had been weakened to the point that rival claimants could tear it apart. Ferdinand's daughter Isabella inherited the crown, but what she inherited was not a stable kingdom. She inherited a fractured nation, divided by bitterness, suspicion, and the unresolved wounds of her father's rule. For years after his death, her legitimacy was challenged. Armies marched across Spain, pretending to fight for tradition or modernity. But beneath those slogans lay a simpler truth. The monarchy had been shattered by one man's excesses. Historians today agree that Ferdinand VII stands among the worst rulers in European history. His political incompetence, stubborn resistance to reform, and cruelty devastated Spain. But what disturbs scholars even more is how deeply his private appetites shaped the destiny of the nation. A king's personal life should never have mattered more than his public role. But in Ferdinand's case, the two were one. His hunger for domination poisoned the palace. His obsession with young women corrupted the court. His paranoia weakened the military. His desperate push for heirs destabilized succession laws. His refusal to restrain his desires eroded the moral authority of the crown, and the Spain he left behind paid the price for generations. The darkest secret of Ferdinand VII is not that he was perverted. It is that his perversion ruled Spain, It dictated decisions, it shaped laws, it manipulated marriages, it silenced ministers, it destroyed colonies, it ignited civil war, and it changed the fate of an empire. Maria Cristina spent her regency trying to repair the destruction he left behind. She dismissed corrupt courtiers, restored a measure of stability, and tried to shield her daughters from the toxic legacy of the king who had tormented her. But even she admitted, in one of her private letters, that the true damage Ferdinand caused could never fully be undone. Spain had survived invasions, famines, rebellions, and plagues, but recovering from Ferdinand VII would take an entire century. His reign became a historical warning that absolute power, when placed in the hands of a man ruled by his darkest impulses, can corrupt a nation from the inside out.